we've got strong labor market. That's got to get hit. There's no other way to really kill inflation without some pain in the labor market. And we're seeing minimal pain. And then the other thing I think is important is to sop up some of the money that was created with the $6 trillion of fiscal stimulus during COVID that's still sloshing around our system, largely, by the way, in corporates' hands. And if they either keep it in their hands or they spend it on assets or they lose to labor and start paying it out in wages, but that money sloshing around is bad for inflation. It's going to be a support higher inflation. And so quantitative tightening should be increased to sop up some of that liquidity. And so without those two things happening, without a significant labor decline and the continued sucking out of this excess liquidity, cash circulating around the system, I think inflation is going to be tough to kill.
Yeah, and I think that's what the inflation part. I think is something that there's too much focus on, like, the reported number. There's a reported inflation number, and everyone is like laser focused on like what is exactly going to happen with like medical insurance, CPI in September versus October, and all this sort of stuff. Which like those of us nerds on FinTwit do find ourselves down that rabbit hole every once in a while, just so that we understand what's going on. But I think, like, taking a step back, super important to come back to what drives inflation. Like what actually drives inflation, which is the amount of nominal spending relative to the amount of nominal production in the economy, sets the clearing price of prices, right? That's how inflation works. And so it's not just like some academic curve that is the reason why, you have to get wages down and labor market weakening in order to moderate inflation. It is like a common sense, intuitive rationale, which is that if you're paying people, the growth of their income is growing at 5 or 6% a year, and the growth of their production is 0 per year, like that leads to higher prices. It just like mechanically has to lead to higher prices. And that is basically where we are in the US. And also importantly, where we are in Europe and in the UK, where we have essentially 0 productivity growth in the and in all of these economies, for a variety of different reasons. But that's basically where we're at. And we have elevated nominal income growth and elevated nominal spending growth. And so until you start to resolve that problem, and productivity doesn't get resolved like in a day, like maybe over 10 years or 20 years, or maybe AI will change.
AI.
We'll have our avatars doing this speech, doing this conversation 5 or 10 years from now. But until that happens, you still have the productivity of us sitting here having a conversation. And that won't change that much. And so you can't change that lever. You have to change the wage lever. And the way wages come down, we know, is through weakening employment. That's a very intuitive understanding of what drives wages. It's not some academic exercise.
It's curve or anything like that. Right. It's just
right. It's just a common sense exercise. And that's the basic problem. And that's why, if we tie it back to that pausing point that I was saying, which is like, it's not just that measured inflation is too elevated relative to these mandates. It's the structural inflation, right? The structural drivers of inflation across the developed world are still elevated relative to the mandates, and central banks, and meaningfully elevated. This isn't like a tweak between 2 and 3. This is meaningfully elevated, and central banks are giving up. They're stopping on expectation that they've done enough. That's a hell of a bet. When you see what the structural inflationary pressures are in these economies.